The dawn broke cold and sharp over the high plains, bleeding pale light across a landscape carved from rock and patience. Harlan Cole moved through it with the same quiet endurance. His routine was a bulwark against the chaos he had once known, each task a prayer for peace. Check the fences, water, the stock patrol, the property line along Snake Creek. It was a life built on solitude, a penance paid in silence. The creek was his boundary, a silver ribbon separating his small world from the vast, indifferent wilderness. But this morning, the wilderness had trespassed. Something was wrong. The air, usually clean with the scent of sage and damp earth, held a metallic tang. His horse Dusty, a creature as steady as Harlan himself, grew skittish ears, twitching nostrils, flaring at an unseen threat. Harlan reined him in his gaze, sweeping the familiar banks. That's when he saw it. A tangle of dark hair caught in the reeds, a swatch of pale calico submerged in the shallows. It was a human form caught in the gentle but relentless pull of the current, a discarded doll in the morning stillness. A jolt, cold and violent, shot through him. Without a second thought, he swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the soft, muddy earth at the water's edge. The creek was frigid, the shock of it stealing his breath as he waded in. The water swirled around his waist, pulling at him, trying to claim him as it had claimed her. He reached the woman's body, his hands finding purchase on the sodden fabric of her dress. She was limp unnervingly, light, her face ashen in the thin light. As he gathered her into his arms, her head lolled back, revealing a constellation of bruises blooming dark against her throat. Her lips were blue, parted in a silent plea. He carried her back to the bank, the water streaming from her clothes, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He laid her gently on the grass, his movements practiced and sure-honed by a past he fought daily to forget. He checked for a pulse, his fingers pressing against the cold skin of her neck. It was there, a faint, thready flutter, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. She was alive. As he shifted her weight to begin pressing the water from her lungs, something slipped from her grasp and glinted in the nascent sunlight. It was a small silver locket, oval-shaped and intricately filigreed, tarnished by the water, but still beautiful. It lay in the palm of her hand, an object her attackers had somehow missed. Instinctively, Harlan reached for it, his thumb brushing over the cool metal. The moment his skin touched the silver, the world fractured. Not a memory, but a sensation. And the deafening roar of gunfire, the splintering of wood, the acrid smell of powder and fear. A woman's scream, high and sharp, echoed in the chambers of his mind, followed by the face of a boy, his eyes wide with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind the ghost of a pain in his gut, and a profound, unsettling sense of familiarity. He shook his head, trying to clear the sudden fog. The locket. He knew that locket. But from where? The woman on the ground stirred a low moan escaping her lips. Water trickled from the corner of her mouth as she coughed a ragged, desperate sound. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with terror and confusion. They darted wildly, taking in the wide sky, the strange man leaning over her, the vast emptiness of the prairie. A low guttural keen tore through the sagebrush, a sound more animal than human that the wind stole and scattered across the plains. He pulled his coat from his saddle and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. She flinched at his touch, but clutched the thick wool as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into pain. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the words sounding foreign, even to his own ears. He had not offered comfort to another soul in nearly a decade. She stared at him, her breathing shallow and fast. She tried to speak, her voice a broken whisper, lost to the sighing of the wind. "They'll come back." Harlan looked from her bruised face to the locket still resting in her palm, and then to the endless horizon. He knew she was right. Whoever had done this would not simply let her go. And the locket in her hand was no random trinket. It was a key, a link to a past he had buried under years of silence and solitude. By pulling her from the water, he had not just saved a life. He had dredged up his own ghosts, and now they stood with him in the cold light of dawn, waiting. The inside of Harlan's cabin was as sparse and disciplined as the man himself. A stone hearth, a sturdy table with 2 chairs a bed, with a neatly folded quilt and a single bookshelf holding worn copies of Shakespeare and Marcus Aurelius. The only hint of a former life was a small locked chest in the corner, its wood dark and heavy with secrets. He laid the woman on a pallet of blankets near the fire. He'd quickly kindled the flames, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn log walls. For a long while she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the hypnotic play of the fire. Her body rigid with a fear so deep it seemed to have settled in her bones. Harlan moved around the small space with a quiet efficiency that was both calming and distant. He boiled water, his movements economical, wasting no motion. He tore a clean strip from a linen shirt and gently began to clean the cuts on her face and arms. She winced at the sting of the hot water, but didn't pull away. Her trust was a fragile, wounded thing, and he knew a single abrupt movement could shatter it. He noticed the locket was still clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. He gestured toward it gently. "That's a fine piece of silver," he said, his tone even. Her fingers tightened around it reflexively. "It was my mother's," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was the first thing she had said since the creek bank. "Did they give it back to you?" he asked, dabbing a cut on her cheek. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "No, I've always had it." She looked down at it as if seeing it for the first time. "He let me keep it. Said it was a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Her eyes clouded over. "Of what happens to people who forget their place." The words were delivered as a rote recitation, a lesson learned through pain. Harlan fell silent, his jaw tightening. He worked without speaking, tending to the rope burns on her wrists, the angry red marks raw and chafed. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of ranch work, were surprisingly gentle. He was a man more comfortable with actions than words, and in the quiet language of care, he offered what he could not say: "You are safe here." As the warmth of the fire slowly seeped into her bones, some of the terror began to recede from her eyes, replaced by a weary exhaustion. She finally looked at him. Truly looked at him, studying his weathered face, the deep lines etched around his eyes, the grim set of his mouth. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "Harlan Cole." "Why are you helping me?" He paused, the damp cloth in his hand. He looked around the cabin at the solitary life he had built. He had no answer that would make sense to her or even to himself, because no one else was here to do it. A fragile truce settled between them in the small, warm cabin. He made a thin broth, which she drank slowly, her trembling hands wrapped around the warm mug. He saw the questions in her eyes, but he didn't push. The story would come when it was ready. He sat in the chair across the hearth, cleaning his Winchester rifle. The familiar methodical clicks of the action, a comforting rhythm in the silence. He was guarding her, but he was also guarding himself. Her presence was a disruption, a stone tossed into the still pool of his existence. And the ripples were spreading outward, touching shores he had long since abandoned. Later, as twilight painted the prairie in shades of purple and gray, she finally spoke her name. "Eliza. My name is Eliza Kane." She then reached into a torn pocket of her dress and pulled out a crumpled, damp piece of paper. She held it out to him. He made me sign this. Said it made me his property. His wife. Harlan took the document and carefully unfolded it. It was a marriage contract, crudely drawn up the signatures, nearly illegible, the official-looking stamp, a clear forgery. But one name was printed in a bold, arrogant script, Mason Crow. The name meant little to him, yet it felt heavy in his hand, another piece of the puzzle that was forming around him. Men like this were a plague on the territories preying on the weak and isolated, using the guise of law to perpetrate lawlessness. They will find me. Eliza whispered, her gaze drifting toward the cabin's single window, where the vast, dark expanse of the plains stretched to the horizon. Mason always finds everyone. Harlan folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He may find this ranch, he said, his voice a low growl. But he'll find me waiting for him. This land still has law, Eliza. Men like Crow just make you forget it. He didn't tell her about the locket or the disturbing flash of memory it had triggered. He didn't tell her that her rescuer was a man haunted by his own brand of lawlessness, a man who understood better than most how easily justice could be twisted into a weapon. For now he was simply Harlan Cole, a solitary rancher. And that was all she needed him to be. That night, as she slept fitfully by the fire, Harlan watched the Winchester across his lap. He opened the locked chest in the corner and pulled out a tarnished U.S. Marshal's star. He stared at it for a long time, the 7-pointed piece of tin feeling heavier than it ever had before. The past was no longer buried. It was here in his house, sleeping by his fire. The next day arrived with a relentless sun baking the plains and bleaching the sky to a pale, washed-out blue. The sense of peace within the cabin was a fragile illusion, a momentary pause before the inevitable storm. The sound came just after midday, the rhythmic, confident beat of a single horse approaching at a steady trot. It was not the sound of a posse, but of a man who didn't believe he needed one. Eliza, who had been sitting at the table, went rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving behind the stark map of her bruises. "It's him," she breathed, her voice tight with panic. Harlan was already on his feet, the Winchester in his hand. He moved to the door, his expression grim. "Stay inside. Don't make a sound." He stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. The rider had stopped just outside the gate of his fence line. The man was everything Harlan was not. He was dressed in a fine black coat, his boots polished to a high sheen, and he sat atop a magnificent black stallion that seemed to pulse with barely contained energy. His face was handsome, framed by dark hair, and a charming, easy smile played on his lips. But his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. It was Mason Crow. "Morning, Cole." Crow called out, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying easily in the still air. He tipped his hat, a gesture of politeness that was purely theatrical. "I believe you have some of my property. A runaway wife. Prone to hysterics, I'm afraid. I do hope she hasn't been too much of a burden." Harlan rested the Winchester in the crook of his arm, his thumb near the hammer. "The only thing in this house is a guest, Crow. A guest under my protection." Crow's smile didn't falter. He swung down from his horse with a fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly. He leaned against the gate, looking Harlan up and down with an air of amused condescension. Protection. That's a noble sentiment. A bit outdated, perhaps. You see, we have laws for this sort of thing now. Contracts. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, a pristine copy of the one Harlan had. "This document says she belongs to me. Signed and sealed. A simple matter of retrieval." "That paper isn't worth the ink it's printed with," Harlan said, his voice low and flat. "She's a human being, not a head of cattle." Crow chuckled a dry, unpleasant sound. Ah, a man of principle. I've heard of your kind. They say you used to wear a star, Marshal. Before the unfortunate business at the Silver Creek mine. Harlan's blood ran cold. Silver Creek Mine. The name was a key unlocking the door to the room in his mind where he kept his worst nightmares. The raid, the fire, the screaming. Crow saw the flicker in Harlan's eyes, and his smile widened, becoming predatory. So you do remember? I wondered if a man can truly forget the ghosts he makes. His voice dropped, laced with a personal venom that was unmistakable. This is more than a simple matter of property, Cole. This is a reckoning. The thin veneer of civility was gone. This was not a dispute over a woman. It was an ambush that had been years in the making. Eliza was not the target. She was the bait. Whatever business you think we have, it's with me, Harlan said, taking a step forward. Leave her out of it. Oh, but she's the entire point, Crow countered, his voice like silk wrapped around steel. She is the instrument of your education. Now be a reasonable man. Open your gate, return my wife, and I'll be on my way. Refuse, and you'll find that my associates are far less eloquent than I am. It was a declaration of war. Harlan knew he couldn't win a straight fight. Crow had men resources and an unnerving knowledge of Harlan's past. His only chance was the law, the real law, not the perverted version Crow carried in his pocket. You'll get nothing from me today. Crow, Harlan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. You want her? You'll have to go through the territorial courts to get her. Crow's expression hardened. The charming facade melted away, revealing the ugly ambition beneath. The courts belong to men who can afford them. You are one man on a dry patch of dirt haunted by the past. I am the future. You've already made your choice. I hope for your sake it was the right one. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, the dust from his departure hanging in the air like a shroud. Harlan stood on the porch for a long time, the Winchester feeling heavy in his hands. The fight was no longer about saving a stranger. It was about surviving his own history. The ride to Red Bluff was a grim, silent affair. Harlan had explained the necessity of the journey to Eliza, his words clipped and practical. She had simply nodded, her eyes wide with a fear that now had a name and a face. She rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her small frame tense with every mile that passed. The world had shrunk to the steady rhythm of Dusty's gait and the solid presence of the man in front of her. Red Bluff emerged from the heat haze of the plains like a mirage, a single dusty main street, lined with weathered false front buildings. It was a town clinging to the edge of civilization, a place where law was often a matter of convenience. Harlan felt the familiar weight of cynicism settle on his shoulders as they dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. He knew men like Sheriff Miller. They saw the law not as a shield for the innocent, but as a fence to be traded to the highest bidder. The office was stuffy and smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. Sheriff Miller sat behind a large desk, his bulk overflowing the chair, a tin of chewing tobacco within easy reach. A greasy stain adorned his vest just below his badge. He looked up as they entered his eyes, small and shrewd. Cole? He grunted by way of greeting. Rare to see you in town. Don't tell me one of your cows wandered off. Worse, Harlan said, placing the crumpled marriage contract on the desk. This young woman, Eliza Kane, was abducted, beaten, and forced to sign this fraudulent document by a man named Mason Crow. Eliza stood slightly behind Harlan, clutching the sleeve of his coat. She looked small and vulnerable under the sheriff's dismissive gaze. Miller picked up the paper, glanced at it, and spat a stream of brown juice into a nearby spittoon. Looks legal enough to me. Got a signature. Got a stamp. He smirked, revealing a gold tooth. Crow's a businessman, a pillar of this community. You accusing him of something, Cole? I'm stating a fact, Harlan said, his voice dangerously quiet. This is a bill of sale disguised as a marriage contract. It's a slaver's charter. From a desk in the corner, a younger man looked up. Deputy Eli Hart was lean and earnest, his face still free of the deep-seated weariness that marked the other men in the room. He watched the exchange with a sharp, intelligent curiosity. Sheriff Eli began, if the lady says she was forced. The lady is likely confused. Miller cut him off, waving a dismissive hand. Crow paid his dues. Contributes to the town fund. A man's got a right to his property. This is a domestic dispute, Cole. Not my jurisdiction. He tossed the paper back onto the desk. Take your guest home and stay out of business that ain't yours. The dismissal was absolute. Harlan had known it would be. Crow didn't just have men and guns. He had bought the law itself. As Harlan turned to leave, his jaws set in a hard line, he felt a light touch on his arm. It was Deputy Hart. Wait outside. Eli murmured, his voice low enough that Miller couldn't hear. Buy the livery. Give me 10 minutes. Harlan nodded once, and then guided Eliza out into the blinding sunlight. The feeling of helplessness was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had come seeking justice and found only a closed door. They waited in the shade of the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. Eliza was silent, her hope visibly crumbling. True to his word, Eli appeared 10 minutes later, his hat pulled down low. He looked over his shoulder before speaking. Miller's on Crow's payroll. Has been for months. You won't get any help from him. So the law in Red Bluff is for sale, Harlan stated. It wasn't a question. The sheriff, as Eli corrected, his eyes flashing with a spark of youthful indignation. But the law is bigger than one corrupt man. I've seen other women come through town with Crow's men. They all have the same look in their eyes that she does. He glanced at Eliza with a respectful sympathy. They're scared. They look like they've been broken. But no one will speak up. They're too afraid. What can you do? Deputy Harlan asked, a sliver of respect entering his tone. Officially nothing. Miller would have my badge. But unofficially. Eli leaned closer. Crow runs his business out of the old mercantile building at the end of town. He keeps ledgers. He's arrogant. He believes he's untouchable. A man like that gets sloppy. If you could find proof something more than a contested signature, I could wire the territorial marshal in Carson City. Go right over Miller's head. It was a dangerous proposition. It put them both outside the official channels of the law, making them vigilantes in the eyes of the sheriff. But it was also their only chance. Crow is expecting me to ride back to my ranch and wait for him. Harlan mused, a plan beginning to form. He thinks I'm isolated. You are on your own, Eli said grimly. But you're not alone. I'll do what I can from here. Keep an eye on Miller, on Crow's men. Create a distraction if you need one. But you'll be the one taking the risk, Harlan. If Crow catches you. Crow and I have history, Harlan said, his gaze distant. It's a risk I have to take. He found a room for Eliza at the town's small, respectable boarding house, run by a stern but kind widow who asked few questions. Leaving her there was the hardest thing he'd done all day. Her fear was palpable. You're coming back, she asked, her voice small. I'm coming back, he promised, with the truth. As he walked back down the dusty street toward the gathering dusk, Harlan felt the familiar weight of the past settle upon him. He was once again a man operating in the shadows, hunting a predator who wore the mask of a respectable citizen. The badge in his chest was long gone. but the instincts remained. And tonight, those instincts told him that the only way to fight a man who had twisted the law into a weapon was to break it himself. The night fell over Red Bluff like a black velvet curtain studded with the brilliant cold diamonds of the stars. The town grew quiet at the rowdy shouts from the saloon, softening to a distant murmur. Under the cover of this darkness, Harlan Cole became a ghost. Dressed in dark clothing, he moved through the alleys and back ways of the town, his steps silent, his senses on high alert. His target was the old mercantile building, a two-story structure at the desolate end of Main Street. According to Eli Crow, used the ground floor as a legitimate supply depot, while his real business was conducted in the office upstairs. A single lamp burned in the upper window, a lone beacon in the dark. Harlan found a position in the deep shadows of the blacksmith shop across the street, watching and waiting. He was a patient man, taught by the land that haste was a fool's game. An hour passed, then another. Just before midnight, the front door of the mercantile opened, and two of Crow's men stepped out, their conversation a low rumble. They headed for the saloon. A few minutes later, the lamp in the upper window was extinguished. The building was dark. This was his chance. He gave it another 10 minutes, letting the silence settle before he moved. He crossed the street like a shadow, melting into the deeper darkness alongside the building. A side window used for loading goods was his best bet. The lock was old and rusted. A few moments of skillful pressure with the tip of his knife, and it gave way, with a faint click. He slid the window open and slipped inside. The ground floor was a cavernous space filled with the scents of canvas rope and dry goods. Moonlight slanted through the grimy windows, illuminating stacks of crates and barrels. He moved toward the back, where a set of stairs led to the upper floor. He took them one at a time, testing each board for a creak before putting his weight on it. The upstairs office was lavishly furnished, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the rest of the town. A thick carpet muffled his footsteps. A large oak desk dominated the room, and shelves filled with leather-bound books lined one wall. It was the office of a man who valued the appearance of power and intellect. Working quickly, using the slivers of moonlight from the window, Harlan began his search. He started with the desk. The drawers were unlocked. He found shipping manifests, supply orders, and land deeds. All of it looked legitimate. Crow was careful. But Harlan's time as a marshal had taught him that every man, no matter how careful, has a tell, a weakness. He moved to the bookshelf. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books, philosophy, history, poetry. It seemed out of place. He pulled one out, a heavy volume of Roman history. It felt wrong. The weight was off. He opened it and discovered the center had been hollowed out. Inside lay a ledger. He carried it to the window, angling it to catch the moonlight. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. The pages were filled with names, women's names, listed next to dates and sums of money. Cities were noted: San Francisco, Denver, St. Louis. It was a detailed record of a human trafficking operation, vast and horrifyingly organized. Eliza's name was there near the bottom of a page dated just a week ago. Next to it in the margin was a small, chilling annotation for Cole. A cold dread washed over him. This confirmed it. Eliza's abduction had been a deliberate, calculated move to draw him out. But why the answer he suspected was not in this ledger. He continued his search, a new urgency driving him. What else was Crow hiding? His gaze fell upon a small framed photograph on the desk, which he had overlooked in his initial search. It was turned away from the door facing the chair. He picked it up. It showed a man and a woman standing proudly in front of an unpainted cabin. Between them stood a young boy, no older than 10, with dark, intense eyes that seemed to burn with a premature fire. The man had a hard, cruel face that Harlan recognized instantly, a face that had haunted his nightmares for years. It was Silas Crow, the leader of the gang he had cornered at the Silver Creek mine. And the boy. The boy was a younger version of Mason. The room seemed to tilt. The past and present collided with the force of a physical blow. Mason Crow was Silas Crow's son, the boy who had watched Harlan kill his father. The entire operation, the women, the wealth, the power, it was all secondary. It was fuel for a fire of vengeance that had been burning for a decade. Tucked behind the photograph was another, smaller, faded image, a close-up of the woman Silas's wife. She was smiling faintly, and around her neck, gleaming even in the old, faded print, was the silver locket. The very same locket Eliza had been clutching when he pulled her from the creek. Harlan sank into the desk chair, the pieces slotting into place with sickening clarity. Crow hadn't just used Eliza as bait. He had given her his own mother's locket. It was a message, a symbol, a deeply personal piece of psychological warfare meant only for Harlan. He was not just fighting a criminal. He was confronting a ghost. He had created a monster, nurtured on a diet of loss and hatred. He now knew with absolute certainty that this would not end in a courtroom. It would end in blood, back where it all began. Just as the terrible truth settled upon him, Harlan heard it, the crunch of a boot on the gravel outside. He was out of time. He quickly slid the ledger back into its hiding place and replaced the book on the shelf. The photograph, however, he slipped into his own pocket. It was evidence, but it was also a reminder of the true face of his enemy. He moved to the back window, the one overlooking the alley. As he peered down, he saw two of Crow's men circling the building, their rifles held at the ready. They were making a routine check. Or maybe Crow's paranoia had finally gotten the better of him. Harlan was trapped. A noise from the street drew the guards' attention. A horse had gotten loose from the livery, and it was kicking up a racket. As the guards moved to investigate the disturbance, Harlan saw Eli Hart step out of the shadows of the livery stable, give a nearly imperceptible nod in his direction, and then melt back into the darkness. The loose horse was Eli's diversion. Harlan didn't waste the opportunity. He swung himself out the window, dropping silently into the alley below. He stayed in the shadows, making his way back toward the center of town. But he knew this was a temporary reprieve. When Crow discovered the break-in, and he would drop all pretense of civility. The game had changed. He went straight to the boarding house. He had to get Eliza out of Red Bluff, back to the relative safety of his ranch. He woke the startled proprietor, and with a few silver dollars and a quiet, urgent explanation, was allowed up to Eliza's room. She was awake, sitting in a chair by the window, as if she had been waiting for him. "I heard horses," she said, her voice trembling. "It's Crow." Harlan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He knows. We have to leave. Now." They slipped out of the boarding house and made their way to the livery where Eli was waiting with their horses saddled. "You found it, didn't you?" Eli asked, his face grim in the moonlight. Harlan tapped his pocket. "More than I bargained for. He's the son of Silas Crow." Eli's eyes widened in understanding. The story of the Silver Creek mine shootout was legend in the territory. A bloody tale of a marshal who had single-handedly wiped out a vicious gang of thieves. "Then this isn't about business. It's a vendetta." "Get your wire to Carson City," Harlan urged. "Tell the marshal everything. Tell him Crow's operation is a front, but tell him to be careful. Crow has the sheriff in his pocket and eyes everywhere." As Harlan helped Eliza onto Dusty, a shout echoed from the end of the street. A light flared in the window of the mercantile. They had been discovered. Go, Eli hissed, pulling his own revolver. I'll hold them off. Eddie, no. It's my job, Harlan. I'm still the law in this town, whether Miller likes it or not. Now ride. Harlan hesitated for only a second. He saw the resolve in the young deputy's eyes. He nodded once, swung into his saddle, and spurred Dusty into a gallop, leading Eliza's horse behind him. They thundered out of town, the sound of gunshots erupting behind them, a sharp, ugly counterpoint to the pounding of their horses' hooves. They rode hard through the night, not daring to look back. The open prairie, which had once seemed so vast and empty, now felt like a trap, every shadow a potential hiding place for Crow's men. Harlan knew they were not riding toward safety. They were riding into the heart of the storm. By the time they reached the relative sanctuary of his ranch, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. They were both exhausted, coated in dust, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Harlan quickly got them inside and barred the door, his rifle at the ready. But Crow didn't come. The morning passed in tense silence. The expected siege did not materialize. The quiet was more unnerving than an open attack. Crow was playing a different game, a psychological one. The proof came in the late afternoon. A lone rider approached not Crow, but one of his hired guns. He stopped 100 yards from the cabin, well out of rifle range. He carried a white flag. He dropped a small object on the ground, then turned and rode away. Harlan waited, watching for any sign of a trap before he walked out to retrieve it. It was a leather pouch. Inside was Eli Hart's deputy badge, bent and tarnished with blood. And with it a note. The script was elegant, precise, and chilling. Cole. Your friend the deputy has been taken care of. An unfortunate accident involving a stolen horse. Sheriff Miller is devastated. I have what you want. She's waiting for you. Come to the Silver Creek mine. Come alone. It's time to finish what you started. The world narrowed to a single point. The mine. The place where it had all begun. Crow had taken Eliza. He had anticipated Harlan's every move, herding him toward this final, inevitable confrontation. He had taken Harlan's ally, taken his hope, and now he was calling him home. To the place where his ghosts were born. There was no choice left. He had to go. The sky above the Badlands was the color of a fresh bruise, a turbulent swirl of gray and purple clouds that promised a storm. The wind howled through the canyons, a mournful cry that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. This was a place of endings. Harlan rode into it, the landscape a reflection of the tempest in his own soul. The Silver Creek mine was a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, its timbers rotting its entrance, a dark maw, promising nothing but decay. He dismounted at the entrance, leaving Dusty untethered. The horse would be no good to him in the labyrinthine tunnels below. He drew his Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight, a small comfort in his hand, and stepped out of the wind and into the oppressive silence of the mine. A single lantern cast a pool of flickering yellow light deep within the main tunnel, drawing him forward. As he approached, shadows danced on the damp rock walls, turning familiar shapes into monstrous caricatures. He found Crow standing in the center of a large cavern, the lantern at his feet. Eliza was there, bound to a support timber, a gag silencing her cries. Standing beside Crow, his arm in a sling and his face pale, was a captive Eli Hart. "Welcome home, Marshal Crow," said his voice echoing in the cavern. He was no longer the charming businessman. His eyes burned with a feverish intensity, the madness of a decade of hate finally allowed to surface. "Does it look familiar? This is where you murdered my father. I watched from the shadows, a boy of 10. I saw you stand over his body, your face like stone. You called it justice. Your father was a killer and a thief, Mason Harlan said, his voice, even his gun, steady. He made his choice. And you were his executioner. Crow roared, his composure cracking. You took everything from me. My father, my mother. She wasted away from grief within a year. He gestured wildly around the cavern. So I built a new family, an empire of the broken and the lost. I took the lessons you taught me, that power is the only law, that the strong take what they want, and I perfected them. He took a step toward Eliza, tracing a finger along her jawline. She flinched, her eyes wide with terror. And then I found the perfect instrument for my revenge. Didn't I, little bird? Crow turned his burning gaze back to Harlan. You think she's just some random girl I snatched. You, the great marshal, a protector of the innocent, and you don't even recognize her. He let out a sharp, mirthless laugh. Her name isn't Kane. It's Miller. Annabelle Miller. Her father was John Miller, a prospector who had a claim just up the canyon. He was an innocent bystander, Harlan. Just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the crossfire of your glorious raid. You didn't even notice him fall. Your justice left her an orphan. The confession hit Harlan with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Eliza, at Annabelle, and saw the ghost of a face he had only glimpsed in the chaos of that day. A man unarmed, stumbling out of a side tunnel, his face a mask of confusion cut down before he could even cry out, a piece of collateral damage in Harlan's righteous war. I found her in an orphanage in Carson City. Crow continued, his voice dripping with venom. I told her stories. Not of a careless marshal who killed her father, but of a brave man who died fighting the outlaw, Silas Crow. I gave her a new name, a new history. I rescued her. And all I asked in return was her help in bringing the real monster to justice. You. Thunder cracked outside, the sound reverberating deep within the mine. The lantern flame flickered wildly, casting the scene in a macabre, strobe-like light. Harlan's world had been completely upended. He was not the hero of this story. He was the villain, the architect of all this pain. Let them go, Mason. Harlan said, his voice thick with a guilt that threatened to choke him. This is between you and me. It was always between you and me. Crow snarled. He pulled a gun, his movements lightning fast. But he didn't point it at Harlan. He pressed it to Eli's temple. Drop your weapon, Marshal, or your young protege pays the price for your sins. Harlan stared down the length of his own gun, then at Eli's terrified face, and then at Annabelle, whose eyes were filled with a horrified, dawning comprehension as Crow's lies unraveled before her. In that moment, Harlan saw the echo of his past failure. Back then, he had focused only on the target, on Silas Crow, ignoring the innocents in his path. He would not make the same mistake again. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his Colt and let it clatter to the rocky floor. Crow's lips twisted into a triumphant sneer. That's it. Now you see. There is no justice. There is only power and loss. He shoved Eli forward, sending the deputy stumbling to the ground. As Crow raised his gun to point it at Harlan, a blur of motion came from the side. With a desperate cry, Annabelle had thrown her body forward, straining against her bonds. The support timber she was tied to, old and rotten, groaned under the sudden pressure and splintered. She fell forward, crashing into Crow, sending his shot wild. The bullet ricocheted off the cavern wall with a high-pitched whine. The distraction was all Harlan needed. He lunged not for his gun, but for Crow, tackling him to the ground. The two men rolled in the dirt, a desperate, brutal tangle of limbs. Crow was younger, fueled by a lifetime of rage, but Harlan fought with the grim tenacity of a man with nothing left to lose. It wasn't a battle of good versus evil. It was a struggle between two broken men, both forged in the violence of that day 10 years ago. As they fought, Eli scrambled for Harlan's fallen gun. One of Crow's men posted in the shadows stepped forward, raising his rifle. But before he could fire, Annabelle, now free of her bonds, grabbed a loose piece of timber and swung it with all her might, striking the man across the back of his knees. He went down with a cry of pain. Harlan finally gained the upper hand, pinning Crow beneath him. He raised his fist, the years of guilt and repressed anger boiling to the surface. He looked down at the face of the boy, whose life he had destroyed, and for a second he was ready to end it. But then he saw his own reflection in Crow's hate-filled eyes, the reflection of a killer. His fist unclenched. No, Harlan grunted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No more. At that moment, the sound of hoofbeats and shouting echoed from the mine's entrance. Eli, having retrieved the Colt, fired a single shot into the air. "In here, territorial marshals!" He yelled, his voice booming in the enclosed space. Crow's face contorted in disbelief and then despair. Eli's wire had gotten through. Real law, impartial and implacable, had arrived. The fight was over. As the marshals swarmed into the cavern, cuffing Crow and his man Harlan slowly got to his feet. He looked at Annabelle, who was staring at him, her face a canvas of confusion, betrayal, and a deep, soul-shattering grief. The chasm between them was vast, carved by a decade of lies and a single fatal bullet. The physical battle was won, but the war for redemption had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath, the mine buzzed with the quiet, grim efficiency of the law. The marshals secured Crow and his men, their faces impassive. They found the other women Crow had been holding in a deeper part of the mine, freeing them from their cages like frightened birds. Eli, despite his injury, gave a full report to the lead marshal, his words clear and steady, cementing his place as a true officer of the law. Amid the controlled chaos, Harlan and Annabelle stood apart, trapped in a bubble of silence. The thunder had subsided, leaving behind the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from the cavern ceiling. The sound was like a clock ticking away the seconds of their shattered reality. Finally, Harlan spoke, his voice raw. He was telling the truth about your father. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to soften the blow. The truth was a blunt instrument, and he owed her its unvarnished weight. His name was John Miller. He was a prospector. He walked into the middle of the firefight. I was focused on Silas Crow. I never saw him until it was too late. I failed him. And in doing so, I failed you. Annabelle wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces of her identity together. Her entire life, the story she had been told, the very foundation of her existence, had been a lie crafted by a monster. And the man who had just saved her was the one who had created that monster and orphaned her in the first place. The contradiction was too vast, the pain too complex. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. They were not tears of fear or gratitude, but of a profound and bottomless grief for a father she never knew, and a life that had been stolen from her twice over. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're Annabelle Miller," Harlan said softly. "You're the woman who survived Mason Crow. You're the woman who just saved my life and the deputies. That's who you are." But his words were of little comfort. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for answers that he didn't have. She saw not a hero or a villain, but a man drowning in his own regret. She turned and walked away, escorted by one of the marshals back toward the daylight, leaving Harlan alone in the cavern with the ghosts of what he had done. He had faced down his past, but he had found no peace, only a deeper understanding of his guilt. Months passed. The prairie seasons turned the harsh sun of summer, giving way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. With the information from Crow's ledger and Eli's testimony, the territorial marshals systematically dismantled Crow's entire network. Corrupt officials like Sheriff Miller were arrested. Cages were opened. The vast, shadowy empire built on human suffering crumbled into dust. Eli Hart, for his bravery, was promoted to Sheriff of Red Bluff, a symbol of a new, more hopeful chapter for the town. Harlan had helped providing information and guidance from the shadows, but he remained on his ranch a solitary figure once more. Annabelle had been taken to Carson City, where the marshals helped her find what little remained of her father's history, a deed to a played-out claim, a few letters. She had a name, a past, but no future she could yet see. Harlan had heard nothing from her since that day in the mine. He expected nothing. Her absence was a constant quiet ache, a daily reminder of his failure. One cool October morning, he saddled Dusty and made a pilgrimage. He rode for 2 days back into the Badlands to the abandoned graveyard near the Silver Creek mine. It took him hours to find the graves, 2 simple, unmarked mounds of stone forgotten by the world. He spent the rest of the day clearing the weeds and resetting the stones. When he was done, he pulled the silver locket from his pocket. He had retrieved it from the marshals, claiming it as evidence. He opened the clasp. Inside were 2 tiny, faded portraits, Silas and his wife, young, and full of a hope that would curdle into violence and grief. He placed the locket on the stone marking the woman's grave, the silver glinting in the late afternoon sun. It was not an act of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. An acceptance of his role in the tragedy, a final letting go of the anger that had defined 2 families for a decade. He was finally making peace with his ghosts. When he returned to his ranch, the journey back felt lighter. A burden had been lifted. As he rode over the last rise, he saw a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney of his cabin. His heart skipped a beat. He spurred Dusty forward, his mind racing. She was there. Not on the porch waiting, but out by the fence line, her sleeves rolled up skillfully mending a broken rail. She had not left. She had come back. He dismounted and walked toward her, his steps uncertain. She looked up as he approached. Her face was no longer haunted. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength, a resilience that was all her own. The fence was down, she said, her voice clear and steady. Cattle could have gotten out. He stopped a few feet from her. Annabelle. I didn't expect. I spent weeks in the city, she interrupted, turning back to her work, wrapping wire with deft fingers. Listening to men in suits tell me who I was, who my father was, what I was owed. It was all noise. The only place I've ever felt quiet was here. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. This land needs work, and I'm not one to run from a tough job. It was not a declaration of love or forgiveness. It was something far more profound. It was a choice, a statement of partnership, a recognition that they were both survivors, both scarred by the same fire, and that perhaps together they could rebuild something new on the ashes of the old. Harlan picked up a pair of pliers from the ground. The top rail is loose too, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. I know, I was getting to it. They worked side by side as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. The silence between them was no longer empty or tense, but comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. They were 2 solitary souls who had found not a cure for their pain, but a quiet place to heal in a land built on struggle. The vast, peaceful landscape around them was a mirror of the hard-won peace they were beginning to find within themselves.